Okay. So, like I said, today we are starting chapter 14, and we're getting into really 13 and 14 are kind of the two halves of the same kind of topic. We're talking about worldwide changes, really around the turn of the 1500 year mark there. Um, in a lot of classes, you would talk about the Renaissance and Reformation together because they kind of go together. They're broken up into two chapters, so we're still continuing with that type of conversation about how the world is around that the year 1500 mark. But in this chapter, we're going to get more into the voyages of discovery, which we started talking about, or we at least made mention of in the last chapter. We'll talk about the voyages of discovery. We will talk about the Protestant Reformation, and then we'll kind of check in on the world. We'll talk about several countries in Europe. We'll talk about some places in Africa. We'll talk about some places in Asia, and we'll kind of see what the world is like, kind of a snapshot of the world around this time period. So that's what we're looking at in this chapter: voyages of discovery, Protestant Reformation, and various nation states. Now I'm paranoid. Okay, I want to make sure I turn my microphone on. Okay, so we're going to start off with these voyages of discovery. Hmm. We've already talked about this. Did we talk about mercantilism? Yeah. Okay. My classes are all running together. I can't remember what I said and what I haven't said. This isn't the best place to talk about this, but we're going to talk about it here because your book mentions it in this chapter. But anyway, the theory of mercantilism is an economic theory, just like socialism, or as we'll talk about in just a second, capitalism, is the idea that the most important actor in an economy is the state. When I say the state, I mean the government. And it's the idea that in order to get the most, bang for your buck, trade should be organized for the good of the state with that as the goal. So it's not about you as an individual. That's what I'm getting at. Mercantilism is not about you as an individual and how can you make money and what's best for your business. Mercantilism is what's best for the country at large. And we've already, I think, run through sort of the rules for mercantilism. That power is based on wealth. And at this point in time, wealth is, gold and silver, precious metals. And since it is based on wealth, there's only so much gold and silver in the world. So there is a finite supply. Power is based on wealth. Wealth is limited. And that in order to get as wealthy as powerful, you need as much wealth as possible. And in order to do that, the government should regulate the economy. Trade should be organized for the good of the state. Power is based on wealth. There is a finite supply of gold. There is limited wealth. The government should regulate the economy by controlling trade. And we've talked about all that before, right? Yes, maybe. Okay. Well, the second part of that we need to talk about is why do countries have colonies? Because we're going to talk about in just a moment these voyages of discovery. All of these European countries are going to begin colonies, and why do they do that? Well, it's because of this. Just use my notes from an hour ago. So mercantilism. Mercantilism assumes a closed loop system. That's the way it works. A closed loop system. I would say that, but a closed loop system. So you've got a colony and you've got the mother country. Remember, the goal is to get as much wealth as possible. So, number one, you want to keep everything in house. You don't want any of your wealth leaking out to another country. So, the job of the colony is to provide natural resources because they don't have any manufacturing. They're not technologically advanced. They can't do anything with, say, the lumber they create because they don't have any factories to ship it off to. Not that we have factories at all yet. You see what I'm saying? These colonies are not as technologically advanced as the mother country. So they harvest the natural resources and they send them to the mother country. The mother country, in turn, will take those natural resources, turn them into finished goods because they do have the technology to do that, and ship them back to the colonies where they sell them for cash money. And so two things are accomplished by this closed loop system. Number one, it prevents any outside actors, like let's say this is England. You know, you've got France over here, and the colony is not allowed to do business with France. That's that government's control and regulate trade. The government says any imports from France, not allowed. If you want to buy French soap, too bad. It's not allowed. The law says you can't do business with France because that would mean your money is being sucked out of England and moved over to France. That makes you weaker and them stronger. You want to keep it all in house. The other thing that a closed loop system entails is that this mother country is making money hand over fist because they get cheap natural resources and they can sell those resources as finished goods for a profit back to the colony. They have a they have a captive market. The colony, if it wants finished goods, has no choice but to do business with the mother country. A closed loop system. So here in a few minutes, when we start talking about the age of discovery and why these countries want to create a colonial system, yes, it is to spread religion. Yes, it does bring fame and glory back to the mother country, but it's also about economics. It's about money. And even if you don't find gold and silver like some of them will, you can still make a lot of money off of mercantilism uh, by trade. And again, the focus is on the mother country. The focus is on the country. It's not about you and your business within this system. It's about what do we do to make the mother country more powerful? Because how are the colonies being treated in this system? Are the colonies being treated good or bad? Bad, right? Because they're losing money. They can't buy cheaper goods from anybody else. They can only sell back to the mother country. They have to buy uh, finished goods at an insane profit from the mother country. The colonies are really not treated very well at all. And this is one of the things that will eventually lead to something like the American Revolution, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. Um, okay, so that's mercantilism. Again, main actor, the mother country, the home government. A new concept, and we'll talk about this later, but your book mentions it in this chapter, so I wanted to bring it up, is another competing theory of economics known as capitalism. Capitalism. Capitalism is the idea of this guy. He's a Scottish economist. Anybody know his name? Adam Smith. Adam Smith writes a book entitled The Wealth of Nations. Now, this is going to be a little bit later on. This isn't until the 1700s. But Adam Smith has a new idea. He says, listen, instead of the main goal being empowering the government, empowering the country, we should focus on private individuals, private citizens. And by allowing private citizens to make unfettered economic decisions, like I said, there are lots of rules and regulations and laws in mercantilism designed to control that flow of goods. He says if we allow the laws of supply and demand to control the flow of wealth and goods and services, it's going to make a lot more money in the long run. He says the supply and demand of a free market, that's what free market means. It means the government doesn't have a lot of laws telling you what to do. You can do whatever you want with your money in this system known as capital. That's what the word capital means. Capital is money that you can invest or use to start a business or factory or whatever. The supply and demand of a free market will generate wealth for private citizens, not for the country, but for private individuals that have capital to invest. And in doing so, the country itself will become stronger in the long run. And of course, capitalism will eventually replace mercantilism as the dominant economic theory. And we'll talk about that and the conflicts with socialism a little bit later on in the semester. But anyway, your book mentions that in this chapter, and we needed to talk about mercantilism anyway. So that's capitalism very quickly. All right. So anyway, Adam Smith, you probably need to know the name of the book, The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations. And right around the American Revolution, I think, 1770s maybe, he writes this book, The Wealth of Nations, and he describes capitalism. If you've ever heard the term laissez-faire, that's Laissez, laissez-faire, it's French. It basically means a free market. The invisible hand of the market, that these natural laws of supply and demand will regulate it. Anyway, we'll get into that later. But again, it's not about the government, it's about private individuals. Adam Smith, who's a Scottish economist. Wrote The Wealth of Nations. All right, so let's talk about the voyages of discovery. And I think we've already covered some of this, so some of it's going to be a bit of a review. Motives for European expansion. We've already spoken about the search for resources, right? As commerce begins to ramp back up after things like the 100 Years' War and the Black Death that we spoke about in the last chapter. They need new sources of natural resources to create new products. We spoke about the cottage industry and the industrious revolution. They're looking for new markets to sell to. They're looking to establish new trade routes. Again, the main place they want to get to is Asia. And yes, you can walk from Europe to Asia. These trade routes known as the Silk Roads, yes, that's possible. Lots of people did it. But it's difficult, it's long, it's dangerous. If they could establish a water route to Asia, life would be much better. Asia is where all the best stuff is. Fine china, silks, spices, precious gems. Okay. And of course, to spread Christianity. There's always a religious component to this. Search for resources, establishing new trade routes, and to spread Christianity, which at this point in time is still pretty much 100% Catholic in Europe. All right. So the first country to really get going on overseas exploration, excuse me, the first European country to really get going on overseas exploration is going to be Portugal. Portugal's got a problem. It's pretty much landlocked. Portugal is surrounded by three sides, is surrounded on three sides by Spain. The only side that is not surrounded by Spain faces the Atlantic Ocean. And so if they want to grow at all, if they want to find new markets at all, if they want to add land at all, if they want new resources at all, they have to look overseas. They don't have a choice unless they want to go to war with Spain. Well, this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator, realizes this. Now, his title, his nickname is the Navigator, but he's not actually like a boat captain. He's a member of the royal family. But he realizes that in order for Portugal to really get up and running, they're going to have to look overseas. And so he is instrumental in making sure that royal funding goes to these voyages of exploration. So Portugal, they are forced to look overseas by geography. And the guy that really realizes this early on and begins developing a plan is Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator. For natural resources, new markets, new lands, so forth and so on. And the first place Portugal is going to look will be Africa. So, I'll come back to that in just a second. All right, so that's Italy. And then we got Spain. This is the Iberian Peninsula. And then Portugal is like right there. And then Africa it does not run into Italy. And so Portugal begins working their way down the coast of Africa, and they establish a colony. And the next year they go a little bit further and establish a new colony. A little bit further and they establish a new colony, and so forth and so on, all the way down the coast of Africa. And so they are establishing all these colonies, hoping to get around Africa, running out of room, hoping to run around Africa and get to India. That's the goal. And they're pretty sure that this is going to work because they have some idea of what the geography looks like, because Africa by this point is not well known to Europe, but they at least know where it's at. They know where India is at. They know where Asia is at. And so they figure if they can work their way down the coast of Africa, they can eventually get around Africa and make their way over to India, which, as it turns out, you can do that. And eventually they succeed. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope. That's the southern tip of Africa, South Africa today. And then in 1498, Vasco da Gama proves that yes, you can get on a boat in Portugal and you can sail down the coast of Africa. You can round the Cape of Good Hope. You can cut across the Indian Ocean. And yes, you can get to India all by water. It is possible. It takes a long time, but it is possible. One thing I should mention about these Portuguese colonies, they get filthy stinking rich. Portugal makes a lot of money off of their African colonies. Number one reason is sugar. Uh, Africa has a tropical climate, and you can only grow sugar in a tropical climate. So Portugal begins these huge sugar, what we would today call a plantation, these huge sugar plantations up and down the coast of Africa, and they make lots and lots of money because, as it turns out, people like sugar. That's the very southern tip of Africa. When Diaz crosses the Cape of Good Hope, it proves that you could sail around Africa. And then 10 years later, Da Gama proves that if you sail around the tip of Africa and cut across the ocean, you can get to India. And like I said, Portugal gets really, really rich off of these African colonies. Sugar, they also extract African gold. Turns out Europe doesn't have a lot of gold of its own, so they steal a lot of African gold. and of course African slavery, which we'll talk about later. But 1498, Vasco da Gama proves, yes, you can get on a boat and sail to Asia. And not a whole lot of people care. It's not that big a deal. It's not that big a news anymore because what happened a few years prior to that? Yeah, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? And I spoke about this in my U.S. history class, but we really put Christopher Columbus up on a pedestal in the United States, right? We named our nation's capital after him, District of Columbia. We celebrate Columbus Day as a national federal holiday. There was a lot of talk, we could be living in the United States of Columbia instead of America. I mean, we placed a great deal of importance, and that's his claim to fame, right? That he, quote unquote, air quotes, discovered the New World. But in the past, I'd say 30 or 40 years, Columbus's reputation has really taken a hit because it turns out he did some really not nice things as well. Part of his agreement, we'll get into what he does in a few minutes. But as part of his discovery of the New World, he is granted lands and he becomes governor of a colony in the New World known as Hispaniola. And he treats the inhabitants of Hispaniola really badly. Thousands of people die, and as a matter of fact, Columbus is going to be placed under arrest and sent back to Spain in chains, and he is forced to answer for what he has done in the New World. And given the treatment of Native Americans by the Spanish, if it was bad enough that they sat up and took notice, that meant that something was really wrong. Um, so I just want you to know that his reputation has taken a bit of a hit in the past 2 or 3 decades. There's been a big push. You might see it sometimes. Instead of celebrating Columbus Day, we need to celebrate uh, like Indigenous Peoples Day. So if you ever see that and see the commentary around that, I want you to know that's why. Uh, Once he was really kind of held up as a shining example of Western civilization, and it's become a bit tarnished over the past few years. But okay, anyway, so we got Columbus. Columbus is a smart guy. This is not his first rodeo. He is a veteran explorer. And deep down in his gut, he knows the world is round. And of course, this was not a popular opinion at that point in time. There were lots of people who did not believe that. But Columbus knows the world is round. Now, he's not the first person to come up with this. Lots of people have theorized over the years that we do, in fact, live on a sphere, a globe. But Columbus was the first one willing to get on a boat and go that way. Everybody else like, we're going to fall off the edge of the world. Columbus says, no, we're not, and I'm willing to prove it. He's willing to put his money where his mouth is. And he just knows that if he sails west from Europe, he's going to get to Asia, which technically I suppose was true. But he severely underestimated the size of the world. He thought it would take like a week or two. Turns out the world is a much bigger place than what he anticipated. So he leaves Europe. Oh, I should say he's sailing not for Portugal, but for Spain. He actually goes to Portugal. And he says, listen, I need supplies. I need ships. I need sailors because I want to prove that you can do this. And Portugal said, we've already got our plan. We're working our way down the coast of Africa. It's going to take a long time, but we're pretty confident in it. We don't need you. And so he goes to next door neighbor Spain, and he goes to Ferdinand and Isabella. And remember, Spain is a new country, right? The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella created a new country, created Spain, and they want to prove themselves. They want to plant their new Spanish flag all over the world. So Ferdinand and Isabella say, sure, we'll give you 3 ships, we'll give you supplies, we'll give you men. And so he leaves Europe in August of 1492. And again, he's thinking a week or two. And he sails, and he sails, and he sails, and they're about to run out of supplies. His sailors are getting angry. They want to turn around and go home, and then finally, in October, they arrive in the Bahamas, probably at San Salvador. And he thinks that he has made it to India because obviously, what does he call the people that he encounters? He refers to them as Indians, because he thought it was an Indian. Turns out not so much. But to the day he died, he swore up and down that he did, in fact, make it over to Asia. Other people are not so sure, and as it turns out, that yeah, he did. And so the Spanish are the first ones over to the New World, and so they're going to get the head start. But the rest of Europe will be hot on their heels because as soon as they realize that this is in fact not Asia, they're wandering around the wilderness trying to find the court of the Chinese emperor, and it ain't there. They know that something's wrong. They realize that these are new lands, and that means that they are open, right? Anybody can come in and plant their flag. So the Spanish are absolutely going to be in the lead, but they're going to be followed by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, by the French, by the English, by everybody else. Everyone wants a piece of the action. Everyone wants a piece of the pie. All right. So the Spanish and the Portuguese got together and they said, listen, we need to give some sort of structure to this. We don't want this to become a free for all. We don't want this to be a mess. We need to give this some sort of structure. So let's sit down and work out a way to divide all these lands. Well, they need a third party. They need a third party that they can both respect the authority of. So who do you think Spain and Portugal both respected? One person that they could both say, yes, that person has authority over me. Somebody, I lost track. Oh, well, who's in the Pope? They go to the Pope because they're both Catholic countries. And they say, hey, Pope, we need help. He says, I'm not doing anything else. Sure, why not? And so they sit down with a big map and they begin carving it up. And this is what they come up with, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, this is actually in German, but it's the best one I could find. And so everything in these dashed lines will belong to Portugal, which includes all of their African colonies. So they're okay with that. They're happy with that. So everything in these dashed lines will belong to Portugal, including a sizable chunk of South America. But everything outside of these dashed lines will go over to Spain, including the rest of South America and all of Central and North America. Now, they didn't realize that that huge landmass was there at that time. If they had, Portugal probably would have been more upset about not getting a bigger chunk of the New World. But at the time, they thought they were getting a pretty good deal. They got to keep all of their existing colonies, plus they got a chunk of new land over in the New World, and they didn't realize that all of this other stuff was going to belong to Spain. But it does. That's the way that it shakes out. And of course, especially in Central and South America, that's why there is such a huge Spanish influence, because Spain was granted the right to colonize those areas under the Treaty of Tordesillas. And pretty much every country in Central and South America does speak Spanish, except for what country? Brazil. And what do they speak in Brazil? Portuguese, because it goes all the way back to the 1400s that under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal got control over what would eventually become Brazil, and that's why they speak Portuguese and not Spanish. So, yeah, stuff that happened hundreds of years ago still has an impact today. So they continue exploring, and you don't have to remember these dates and names. I'm probably not going to test you on that. Um, but they still continue exploring. These voyages of exploration didn't end just because they discovered the New World. In 1513, Balboa becomes the first person to see the Pacific Ocean. He crosses the Isthmus of Panama. An isthmus is a little tiny narrow strip of land. It's the narrowest point between North America and South America. It's where the land gets really skinny. He crosses that and he sees the Pacific Ocean for the first time. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan sets sail. His goal is to sail around the world. He wants to become the first person to sail around the world. He doesn't. As a matter of fact, he dies. He gets close. They set sail from Europe. They go all the way over to the New World. They go all the way around the tip of South America through what become known as the Straits of Magellan. Incredibly rocky voyage, incredibly difficult voyage up to that point. And then he gets to the Pacific Ocean. And the Pacific Ocean is huge and flat and calm. And he says, man, this is peaceful. That's what Pacific means. It means peaceful. Magellan names it that after his very difficult journey. He gets to the Pacific, and it's much easier. And so Magellan himself makes it all the way to the Philippines. He gets involved in some local religious dispute. He gets in a fight and ends up dying. But the remains of his voyage actually do sail around the world. He set off with like 5 ships. Only one of them survive all the way to the end. But a few of his original men that he actually set out with managed to circumnavigate the world. So yeah, he didn't make it, but the group did. James Cook was a captain who sailed for England, and he is the one that's responsible for discovering places like Hawaii and Australia. And that was really kind of the end of the voyages of discovery. Once Australia and Oceania, once that area is discovered, that's pretty much it. Those are all the major land masses that are accounted for. Okay. All right. So back to the New World. The Spanish are beginning to colonize the New World. They've got all this land. They've finally come to the realization, or they finally agree that this is a new land. It's not Asia. It's not India or China or wherever. And they begin exploring. And again, Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, air quotes, discovered the New World because there were hundreds of millions of people already living here. That's why you kind of always got to put an asterisk beside it. Because, yeah, okay, Europe didn't know it existed, but there were still hundreds of millions of people living in North and Central and South America. Well, the first European to encounter a major civilization is this guy, Hernando Cortez. Cortez is a minor Spanish noble. He is an explorer, and he decides that he's going to go explore the New World. And so he gets his ship together and gets his men together, and he sails off. And he lands in modern day Mexico, and he walks into the jungle. And he encounters these small villages and small towns, and they say, well, you don't want us, you want the big city down the road. You don't want us, you want the big city just over the hill. And so he's walking and he walks and he walks, and then one day he walks out of the jungle into this clearing, and he sees this city, Tenochtitlan, and it's huge. It's bigger than Paris, bigger than Rome, bigger than London. It's at least as big or bigger than pretty much any major European city. Huge stone monuments. It's built on this island out in the middle of the lake, and so there's canals running through the city. Just incredible material wealth. There's gold and there's silver everywhere. It's obvious this is a major developed civilization, and Cortez is stunned because no one expected this in the New World. No one expected this level of organization. No one expected this level of wealth in the New World. He cannot believe what he's seeing. Tenochtitlan, this is the capital city of the Aztec people, or the Mexica people that live in modern day Mexico. And so Cortez sees this city, he sees this empire of millions of people, He sees this gold and silver, and what does he decide to do? Kill everybody. Cortez is the first of the conquistadors. Conquistadors, literally the conquerors. He sees this wealth. He sees the land and says, I'm going to take it for myself. And that's exactly what he does. Cortez is going to conquer the Aztec Empire. Well, not everyone. That's a bit dramatic. He kills a lot of them. Yeah, now part of it he did through. It's not like he just went to war. He was greeted as a friend, and so he was brought in by the leaders. And Montezuma was the Aztec leader that brought him in, and they treated him very well. And then he killed them all. Yeah. Okay, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But the way that this ties into Cortez and the Aztecs, when Columbus began his voyage, he started a series of global exchanges. Now, it's true, there is evidence that people had been to North America. There's evidence that Vikings were here. I even saw a book once that claimed that the Chinese had managed to sail across the Pacific over to the west coast of the modern day United States. Um, but Columbus was the first time that permanently there are going to be exchanges between the old world and the new world. It's known as the Columbian Exchange. New links between the old world, that is Europe, and the new world of the Americas. The first time permanent links are established between the old world and the new world. It has incredibly dramatic effects because we are going to see the exchange of not just like biology, although biology will be a huge part of it, but it's also the exchange of culture. Like earlier, I mentioned Central and South America have a very strong Spanish culture because people brought over Christianity. They brought over the Spanish language. They brought over, Spanish culture, the way of dress, the food, songs, whatever. It's not just an exchange of like crops, although that will be big, and we'll talk about that. But it's also an exchange of culture, of language and religion and ideas. And like I say, it will have pretty dramatic effects. One of, if not the most dramatic effect, will be the death of tens of millions of people. We don't know how many people lived in the New World because the Native American groups did not keep, they didn't have censuses every 10 years. They didn't keep accurate population data. Probably somewhere around the range of 120 million people lived in the New World before Columbus showed up. And as a result of these Columbian global exchanges, probably somewhere around 80 million are going to die. Just incredible devastation. A lot of them will be due to violence. That's absolutely true. Just like Cortez decided to conquer the Aztecs, that's exactly what happened. There was a lot of violence. But more than violence was disease. Things like typhoid and cholera, influenza, smallpox, the measles. They will kill tens of millions of people. Alfred Crosby was a historian who came up with a theory as to why this happened. It's known as the virgin soil thesis. And his argument, and I think the data bears this out, says that Native Americans were killed by European diseases. Well, I mean, we're living in the middle of a pandemic right now, right? Why are people so susceptible to the coronavirus? What's the problem? Let me rephrase that. Back when this pandemic first began, if you were watching the news, you probably heard it referred to as the novel coronavirus. What does that mean, the novel coronavirus? That's exactly it. It's novel, it's new. And so nobody has any resistance built up. There are no antibodies to it. Same thing happened with the Native Americans. They had never been exposed to European diseases. And since there was no herd immunity for smallpox or measles or influenza. I mean, we still deal with that today, right? People get the flu all the time. People get measles all the time, but it's so watered down and diluted because we have acquired those immunities, those antibodies to these diseases. Chickenpox isn't going to kill you today. It might have back then because there was no exposure. They had no prior exposure, and it's going to kill tens of millions of people. The virgin soil thesis. Virgin soil had never been exposed to it before, and it was super deadly. There is an upside, as I mentioned, crop exchanges. Things that existed in the old world got transplanted over to the new. Things that only existed in the new world were transplanted back to the old world. So things that existed in the new world, things like corn and tomatoes. Think about it, there was no marinara in Italian food until Columbian Exchange. Tomatoes, potatoes, I think those are vanilla beans, tobacco. Those all existed in the new world and eventually got moved over to the old. Things from the old world that came to the new world: citrus fruits, apples, bananas, onions, that's wheat there on the bottom. So there are crop exchanges. And the reason that's an upside is because these crop exchanges, people are getting better diets, they're getting more diverse diets, there's more food available. There is going to be a population boom, a global, even counting the tens of millions of people that are dying in the new world. If you look at the earth as a whole, we actually see the population creep up because we have better diets. Something I didn't mention, the new world also got domesticated animals. Native American groups did not have any domesticated animals. There were llamas and alpacas, and that's it. They didn't have horse or oxen or sheep or goats or dogs or cats or whatever. Yeah, yeah. When the Spaniards, just think about it. You're a Native American. You see this huge ship appear on the horizon. You've never seen anything like it. It pulls up, and these Spaniards step out. They've got rifles. They've got metal armor. They're riding horses. They literally thought that these people were gods that came from wherever the gods lived because they had never seen anything like that before. Yeah. And we see the birth of truly global trading there. And we've talked about long distance trading, and so Europe traded with Africa and traded with Asia, and they all traded with each other. But now, for really the first time in human history, we have the birth of truly global trading networks, actually like wrapping around the earth, not just sort of regional. Truly global trading networks. Yeah, that was one of the reasons that the Aztecs actually welcomed in Cortez and his men, because they were just overawed with what was going on. All right, that's the voyages of discovery. I'm going to shift a little bit now and talk about the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation. So this is going to be mostly about religion. So just to sort of refresh, and I think I've already mention this, but just a bit of a background on the medieval church, on the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. First thing I want you to remember, it's incredibly wealthy. Incredibly wealthy. And with that wealth comes a lot of political power. Even though it wasn't it wasn't a government by itself, it did own a lot of land. I don't have a map handy, but it owned a huge chunk of land in Italy. It was known as the Papal States. Papal refers to the papacy, the Pope. So it's incredibly wealthy, it's incredibly powerful, and it does not have the best reputation. Because of that wealth, because of that power, a lot of people saw the church as a means to an end. And so they didn't want to join the church because they felt like they were being called to be a spiritual leader of people. They wanted to join the church because they thought it would make their life easy, or it would make them rich, or it would grant them a lot of political power. And so as we move out of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and Reformation, a lot of people have problems with the church. And, very broadly speaking, I think you can lump these into three different groups. Anytime you see clerical, that refers to the church, like the clergy. People have problems with clerical immorality. You have priests that would drink and gamble and have children, which is not allowed. They couldn't technically get married, but they would have, a common law wife. They would have someone, a housekeeper, quote unquote. That in actuality was their wife. You have clerical ignorance, and I think maybe we mentioned this in the last chapter. Uh, Mass was to be conducted in Latin. And so the people didn't really know what you were saying, and they didn't know if you were wrong or not. So you had priests that were not well trained to be the leader of their flocks, right? You have priests that don't know what they're doing. And from the layperson's point of view, that's their, immortal soul at risk, right? They don't want somebody who just walked in off the street, conducting mass and being responsible for their everlasting soul. So they got a problem with that. And then the last problem is clerical pluralism. If gaining church office was a way to power and money, what if you could have two church offices? What if you could be the priest in two different districts? What if you could be the bishop of two different dioceses? Um, and this happened. Pluralism, more than one. People were holding more than one church office in order to gain more power and more money. That was a relatively common occurrence. And of course, you can't be priest in two places at once. So people have a big problem with this. Exactly. You just weren't there on Sunday. You weren't there for mass. And so your people just had to do just whatever. Yeah. Well, and that's what we're getting at. Eventually they're not going to accept it anymore. Yeah. So here comes this guy, Martin Luther. Martin Luther, born into, I think for the time was considered I mean, he wasn't rich, but like a upper, I think we would call him today like an upper middle class. He was not a member of the aristocracy. His father, I think, was a copper miner. But, I mean, they had enough money to send Luther to school. So he did. He went to what we would today call college, university, and he graduated, and he became a professor at the University of Wittenberg. University of Wittenberg, and he was also an Augustinian friar. And Martin Luther was the model friar. If all of these problems that people had with the church, that did not apply to Martin Luther. He was the best friar he could be. He did everything by the book. And yet he felt like he was missing something. Even though he was going through all the motions, he did all the right things, he said all the right things, he himself, he just did not feel fulfilled. He didn't think that it was enough. He didn't feel right. And so he sat down and he started reading his Bible. And remember, that's not something that most people can do. Most people, number one, don't own a copy of the Bible. Number two, if they did own a copy of the Bible, they can't read. And if they could read, they really couldn't read in Latin or Greek, which is what all Bibles were written in. But he's different. He's educated. He's a friar. He's got access to all this stuff. And so he sits down and begins to study. And he comes up with a new motto or catchphrase or doctrine, a guiding principle. He says, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. This is actually a big deal. Remember, I think I mentioned this last week, maybe. The medieval church was a gatekeeper institution. The medieval church said, if you want to get to heaven, you have to do A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3, X, Y, and Z. You have to do these things. We, from the perspective of the church is the only way that you get into heaven. The church is the only way that you can earn salvation. You got to go through the process that we, the Catholic Church, lay out. That was the medieval church. And here comes Luther, who says, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. It's not about the process. It's not about the organization. It's not about the church. It's about faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Bit of background. This is a bit of a story. So I want you to know who the main players are, but you don't necessarily have to remember all the details. But this is what happens. So there is a Catholic archbishop, the Archbishop of Mainz. And the Archbishop of Mainz is looking for a promotion. He's looking for a step up. He doesn't want to give up his old office. He wants to keep that office and get another office in addition to it. The Archbishop of Mainz wants another church office. He wants to commit pluralism. Well, before he can do that, he's got to get permission from the Pope. And so he goes to the Pope and he says, hey, Pope, or Leo the 10th, I think. He says, hey, Pope, I want this other diocese. And the Pope says, okay, but, and those of you who can't see me online, I'm rubbing my fingers together in a method suggestive of money. If you want this other church office, I'm going to need a donation to my whatever. And Archbishop of Mainz says, I ain't got any money. That's why I want this other church office so I can get more money. And Leo says, all right, well, don't worry about it. This is what we're going to do. I am going to authorize a special sale of St. Peter's indulgence. And you're going to be responsible for selling them. And I'll get part of the money because I'm the Pope. And you get part of the money, which then you can pay to me to make this donation. So the Pope's making money hand over fist. And the Archbishop of Mainz says, okay, I will sell these indulgences. You will get part of the money. I'll get part of the money, which I will then pay you. You will grant this exception, and I will get this other church office, and everybody goes home happy. So the Archbishop of Mainz contacts Johann Tetzel, and he says, Tetzel, you're a great salesman. I want you to go out and sell these indulgences. And Tetzel says, sure thing, boss. And he goes out, and he is a fantastic salesman. He is selling indulgences left and right, making tons of money. Martin Luther has a very big problem with this because of what an indulgence is. Now, I am not an expert on medieval Catholicism. I will admit that right off the bat. But this is the way that it worked. If you committed a sin, if you were a Catholic in the medieval church and you committed a sin, there were two parts to it. Number one, you had to go to confession, right? You had to confess your sins to a priest, and you had to get salvation. You had to get forgiveness. That was from God. God, Big G, the Christian God. But you also had to perform earthly penance. He would prescribe something for you to do, right? Yes, you can ask for forgiveness and God will grant you forgiveness, but you also got to say 20 Hail Marys. Or you got to go work in the monastery gardens for a week. You have to perform some sort of earthly penance to erase this sin from your record. Well, that led to a problem because what happened if you confessed your sins, you were granted, forgiveness from God, and you were given this penance to perform, and then you walked out of the confessional booth and you dropped dead of a heart attack? You've been granted forgiveness from God, but you still have this penance on your record. What happens? You don't go to hell because you were forgiven. You can't go to heaven because you had penance left. Where do you go? Hell and heaven, I guess. Yeah, you go in the middle. You go into limbo. You go to purgatory. And your soul would reside in purgatory until that penance was worked off or forgiven or something like that, which is not really what you want to hear, especially if you've got like a relative that had a penance, they died, and now what's going to happen? Aha, indulgences. An indulgence was like a check that was written on a bank account. The medieval church's position was Christians throughout the past and present have performed infinite numbers of good works. That's what a penance was. It was a good work. Have performed infinite numbers of good works. And so all those good works go into a bank account. And the church controls that bank account, and we can write out a check that will draw on that account of good works. So that's what an indulgence was. An indulgence was an excused penance. And you could buy them and apply them to your relatives. I know my uncle died and he had penance that he had not completed, so I'm going to go buy an indulgence, and that will excuse him and get him out of purgatory. But eventually it got to the point where people were buying these up for themselves. They were like a get out of hell free card. If I commit a sin, and I know I'm gonna, all I got to do is ask for forgiveness, which God pretty much has to give me, and then I've got these indulgences in my back pocket. I won't even have to do penance. It's a win-win. That's what Luther had a problem with. Luther had a big issue with the sale of these indulgences. He did not like them. He did not like them. And so in 1517, Luther wrote out all the problems that he had with this. Turns out he had 95 of them. 95 theses that, you've had comp one. A thesis is like a main idea. These are my 95 ideas on the power and efficacy of indulgences. And he, according to legend, he did it very dramatically. He marched up to the church door in Wittenberg and he nails this huge scroll with all of his problems. And it was like, medieval mic drop. And he was like, all right, I'm done. And of course, it creates a huge stir that here is, remember, he is an Augustinian friar. He's a member of the clergy. Here is a member of the church calling them out. It creates a huge firestorm. Eventually, the Pope gets wind of this and he says, this is not going to stand. I can't do it. Luther, you need to come here and we need to sit down and talk about this. Luther says, no. Pope says, you got to stop talking about this. We're going to burn all of your writings. You're going to apologize, and you're going to say that you were wrong. And Luther says, nope. And the Pope says, all right, you do it or you're excommunicated. And again, I'm not an expert on Catholicism. Being excommunicated, from what it doesn't mean that you're kicked out of the church, but it means you're no longer allowed to partake of the sacraments, which means that if you happen to die, you're putting your immortal soul in jeopardy. And Luther says, whatevs, I don't care. I'm out of the church. And when people hear this, it's a big deal. Because all of these people that have had problems for all this time with the church, and they're hearing that the church isn't required. I mean, here's Luther saying all you need is your Bible, all you need is a personal relationship with God, all you need is your faith. You don't need good works, you don't need to study all the writings of the Pope. That really resonated with a lot of people that had all these problems with the church. And it is going to spread like wildfire. I just want you to know this guy's name, Ulrich Zwingli. Just remember Zwingli. Um, Luther is the father of the Reformation. That's kind of his claim to fame, right? Zwingli was having these same ideas at around the same time. So if it hadn't started with Luther, it might have started with Ulrich Zwingli. I just want you to know he's another guy that's very influential in the early Reformation. And of course, Luther goes on to start his own church, the Lutheran Church. And the thing about it is, I mean, Lutherans, Catholics, they're all Christians, and they have a lot of the same practices. Like, for example, the Lutheran church believe in a lot of the same sacraments. But on the other hand, Lutheran priests can marry. And so there's a lot of similarities. They kept a lot of the same teachings, but there's also a lot of divergence as well. So the big difference between the medieval Roman Catholic Church and these new Protestants, if you had to boil it down to very broad, wide sweeping statements, what is the point of church? What does the church teach? Well, the Catholic Church taught that you got to have faith, but you also had to do good works. Luther taught that you had to have faith alone and that it was God's decision. You couldn't buy your way into heaven. That's what Luther was making the argument. He said the medieval church is set up so you could technically earn your way into heaven. Luther didn't believe that. He said faith alone, it's God's decision. You don't have any agency in it. You can do all the good works you want to, and you should, but it's not going to help you get into heaven. The medieval Catholic Church said, well, you got to study the Bible, but you also got to study all these traditional, like everything that the popes have written since, the first pope showed up. All of that stuff is really important, and you need to know that stuff. Luther said, no, it's just the Bible. That's all you got to have. And in fact, Luther will translate the Bible into German so that ordinary people could read it for the first time. That's a huge accomplishment of his. And then lastly, if you'd ask the medieval church, what is the church? They would have said, well, it's the church. You got the Pope at the top, and then you got cardinals, and you got archbishops, and you got bishops, and you got all the way down to your local parish priest. And it's the hierarchy. That's the church. And Luther would have said, no, it's not the hierarchy. It's not, some people at the top, some people in the middle, some people at the bottom. It's all believers. And a great example of that in the Catholic Church, usually the priest is referred to as what? You would say father, because he was a position of authority. He was a position of respect to you. But if you go into a Protestant church, like if you walk into a Baptist church, the pastor is not referred to as father, he's referred to as brother, which is a position of equality. And there are all flavors of Protestants. Luther was the first. Luther starts his church, the Lutheran Church. But we'll talk about other ones. But there are any number of Protestant churches. Like I say, different flavors of Protestantism that has grown up in the years. All right, and that's where we will stop for the day. When we come back next week, because today is Thursday, we will talk about the spread of the Reformation, Don't forget that you have a quiz. It's on Blackboard. You go into course content, the assessments folder. Quiz number 1. Be sure to take it before Sunday at midnight. That's when it closes. Won't take you long. You've only got a 15-minute time limit. It's 10 questions, multiple choice. Make sure you get it done. And I will see you guys next week.